Hi, so I'm finally doing this Q&A video. It always turns out to be more demanding than I thought. Some of you have noticed that my previous Q&A video for 3,000 subscribers was deleted. That's mostly because I showed my face in it and I overestimated my confidence. Anyway, I got a lot of really good questions. I obviously can't answer all of them. I wish I could, but there's too many, so sorry if I don't answer yours. Anyway, I gotta start out by answering this question again.
My question is superficial, but I feel I should ask, why the name cuck philosophy?
Essentially, I knew that left-wingers are commonly labeled cucks by internet right-wingers, and I was watching a ContraPoints video one time where she was responding to a channel named Red Pill Philosophy, and I jokingly said, I'm gonna start a channel called Cuck Philosophy, and I actually did it. So it's kind of a preemptive defense mechanism against people who use cuck as a political insult. I've kind of already made the joke for them. A lot of people want me to change it, but I don't think I will. It's become somewhat of a trademark. Apparently someone from Chapo Trap House posted a thumbnail of my video with the caption, "No way I'm watching that." I'm wondering now if it was the video on why equality is unhelpful as a political goal, because I'm realizing now how misleading that title could be coupled with the name Cuck Philosophy. Hopefully he ended up watching it in the end. So someone asked me how continental philosophy differs from Eritrean philosophy, and when I asked them for examples of Eritrean philosophy, they revealed that it was a joke, which is a shame because I was looking forward to learning about Eritrean philosophy. Anyway, the mistake people make, like Richard Dawkins in this tweet, is that continental philosophy is not a geographical description, as it's not contrasted with another location, but with analytic philosophy. You can do continental philosophy no matter what part of the world you're from. It's just a label based on its place of origin. Just like, for example, the currently dominant interpretation of quantum mechanics is called the Copenhagen interpretation, but that doesn't mean that only people from Copenhagen can adopt it. Or how certain developments in formal logic have been called Polish logic. Is it arbitrary? Yes, insofar as literally all names that we give to things are arbitrary. Now, even geographical groupings can be useful when we're talking about the history of philosophy. For example, if you say modern German philosophy, I'll instantly have figures such as Leibniz, Kant, and Hegel in mind. And if you say modern French philosophy, I'll have figures like Descartes and Rousseau in mind. It's much quicker to mention the geographical category than to name a bunch of figures. And historically, philosophers were often responding to other philosophers from the same country and thereby developing similar approaches or concerns. And also their philosophies would often reflect the current cultural or political concerns of the region. So a geographical category becomes more than just a delineation of space.
Why are so many works, specifically here philosophical, written as to cause them to be difficult to read and understand? Wouldn't that be to the work's detriment?
Someone has already made a really great reply to this. You can pause if you want to read it. Basically, one thing is that sometimes philosophy simply has to be difficult. People have this mistaken idea that philosophy is just smart people talking about stuff, when it's an entire field with its own disciplines, its own schools, methods, terminology. You wouldn't jump right into current debates in formal logic and complain that it's too difficult without even knowing the basics of formal logic. You also wouldn't complain about a certain art or cultural critic critiquing a piece that you don't know about. The thing is, a lot of philosophers, even philosophers who were celebrities like Derrida or Foucault, don't write books to have them become eternal bestsellers. They write for other philosophers or other people with knowledge in philosophy. And, well, for that purpose, their writing styles, difficult as they are, have not prevented their influence. And also, because they weren't writing books to be eternal bestsellers, they were responding to a lot of contemporary issues, which were relevant at the time, but not so much now. For example, some post-structuralists were responding to then popular developments in psychoanalysis and simply assumed that people would already know about these developments, while in 2018 it's likely that readers aren't necessarily aware of how Lacan interpreted Freud, and so reading older philosophical works can take some extra research and Googling. Also think, for example, of my video on American Psycho. I'm not gonna pronounce his name anymore because you complain however way I do it. In it, I explained both what structuralism is and what sign value is, which amounts to about 2 pages of script. Now, if I was writing a paper for university, I wouldn't explain those words, I would simply use them, because I'd know that I'd be read by philosophy professors. So what for the general audience is 2 pages of writing, for an academic context can become just 2 words. What I'm saying is, although I won't deny that some of the difficulty is due to just flaws in writing style, as a general rule, the more accessible you try to make a difficult philosophical work to be, the longer it becomes, unless you leave out a lot of the details. It's funny how, for example, Jordan Peterson fans, and I'm sorry I mention him all the time, but it's a good example, they look at a work on postmodern theory and say, well, I can't understand any of it, so it must be trash. And you may reply, well, yeah, if you jump right into it, it might be difficult, but here's a good introductory work. And they mostly disregard it in the manner of, why would I want to learn about that garbage? So it's like, if you're not interested in learning about it, that's fine, but don't act like that's the philosopher's fault. Lastly, when it comes to late 20th century continental philosophers in particular, some of them are so difficult to read because they did not believe that you can neatly separate the aesthetic style of a work and its content. So often, their writing style reflects their theoretical views. This can make the work a lot harder to read, but it's not necessarily correct to say that it's detrimental to the work, because in that case, the style is part of the work. For example, if you've seen my video on Sonic, you'll know that Derrida believed that words are sustained by their opposites, and so there's always something arbitrary about elevating them into eternal categories. In his works, he tried to avoid this by playing with language, doing wordplay, puns, and the like. His works are deconstructive, and therefore so hard to pin down. Or Deleuze, for example, believed that philosophy must, quote, force people to think, to force them out of the academic cliches that they are used to. And so the concepts that he creates often have numerous connections to other theories, certain associations, or multiple uses, and so on.
Do you watch anime? If so, do you have any favorites?
I have watched some in the past. My favorite show is Aku no Hana. I didn't care much for the Neon Genesis Evangelion series, but I enjoyed the ending movie a lot. I've also enjoyed Serial Experiments Lain, and when I was younger, I was obsessed with Dragon Ball.
What was the biggest, most significant political, philosophical change of mind you had, and what prompted it?
I think the most persistent one was generally becoming a leftist. When I first got into politics, I was a right libertarian. I actually listened to Penn Jillette and Ayn Rand and stuff. Like a lot of people, I was also into the whole anti-SJW YouTube craze. I thought that it is right libertarians that are the quote-unquote rational ones. Funnily enough, what prompted the change was Bernie Sanders, but not his policies. It was the way right libertarians responded to his campaign. See, at the time I was living in Norway, which is a social democracy, I heard about Bernie Sanders and thought, okay, whatever, he wants to make the US into a social democracy the way that Norway is, no big deal. And then I saw the response from the libertarian right, the way that they were saying that his policies will crash the economy and turn it into the Soviet Union. I thought, geez, if they're lying about this so much, maybe they're lying about other things too. And long story short, that led me into leftist YouTube, and I saw the light.
Are there any philosophers who you think are underappreciated, underread?
Nowadays, in the general public, most philosophers are underread. I think post-structuralists like Derrida and Deleuze are very much worth reading today, but people usually like to criticize them without understanding them more than they like to read them. When it comes to really obscure ones, I enjoy some of the figures of 19th century German pessimism. One particularly fascinating one was Philip Mainlander. Maybe someday I'll make a video on him. He held a teleological view of history, but for him, it was not the self-consciousness of spirit that was the goal of history, like for Hegel. For him, the non-existence of all things was the goal. Essentially, he saw the universe as the rotting body of God, and so death as the purpose of all things. He ended up hanging himself, standing on copies of his own books, and he was also a self-identified communist.
You have only 16 videos. First one from just 9 months ago. Yet one of the most popular videos of yours approaches 300k views. You have 35k subscribers. What is your approach to growing your channel?
I have absolutely no tactics. The channel got its kickstart when my video on Jordan Peterson was posted on the Chapo Trap House subreddit. I guess that's just the kind of video that gets a lot of attention.
Please rank the Death Grips discography.
Out of the ones I've listened to, worst to best is Government Plates, People on the Moon, Bottomless Pit, No Love Deep Web, Jenny Death, The Money Store, and the best is Ex-Military.
Why do you think there's been a recent fetishization with space coming from both Trump's government but also from businessmen like Bezos and Musk?
I think it's just that when you don't believe in any kind of progressive political project, as the upper classes certainly don't, and capitalism demands infinite expansion, there comes a point where the only place you can expand anymore is into space. If we give up the project of actually qualitatively changing the way our lives are organized, the only sense of progress we get is this quantitative spatial expansion.
What's your favorite movie, if you have one?
Synecdoche, New York.
How do you choose your seemingly random topics for which you critique?
It happens entirely by accident. When I started this channel, I had just watched Glitter, and I thought it would be fun to do a Marxist analysis of a movie that isn't taken seriously, so I did Glitter. With Sonic, I was just reading a book on
Buddha.
At the time, there was a section on the book on his deconstruction of the life-death binary, and I thought I could try applying it to a video game that has an immortal character. I looked around at lists of immortal video game characters, and Shadow the Hedgehog was there. So I read up on the plot of Sonic Adventure 2 and saw that I could make something out of it.
Is it possible to synthesize the Marxist grand economic model with more POMO approaches to the inherent limits of all such models?
I don't think it is, as Marxism as a worldview is such a grand example of what postmodernists went against. And a lot of postmodern philosophers put out scathing critiques of it. However, although I don't think it's possible to synthesize postmodern theory with Marxist theory, it is possible to synthesize it with Marxist praxis, although I think it's inherently resistant, not incompatible, but inherently resistant to the authoritarian strand of Marxism.
Will you name the 3 or 4 most significant thinkers over the last century?
Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and maybe Derrida.
What philosophical, political texts have you found to be most beautifully written?
Early Marx, when he was still speaking in Hegelian humanist terms, like a contribution to Hegel's philosophy of right. 1,000 Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari, which is incredibly painful to read purely for the theory, but I think the language they use is beautiful and fascinating. Some of Mark Fisher's stuff, like The Ghosts of My Life, and also all of Schopenhauer's works, if not for beauty, at least for its clarity and imagery.
Which philosophers or philosophical schools do you dislike the most?
All right, time to make some people upset for no reason. Foundationalism in epistemology, essentialism in metaphysics, and utilitarianism in ethics.
Something that's been a question in my mind is Antifa. It's obviously used as a dog whistle and a whataboutism and other bad things by liberals and fascists, but it itself is kind of fascinating to me. Is saying that there is no one big Antifa organization a no true Scotsman fallacy, to put it in the rational terms? Does the unfair media coverage of them affect their actions and opinions?
I don't think it's a no true Scotsman to say that there's no one big Antifa organization, because it's true. There's no official membership, just dispersed groups, and you don't need approval from the Antifa Council to take up that banner. Now, the question of its legitimacy is an interesting one. Since Antifa does not gain its legitimacy from any long-lasting tradition or legal or bureaucratic process, it can only gain legitimacy from direct support and numbers. And this is why Antifa in the US has not been as effective as in, for example, France and Germany, where anti-fascist action is more common and has had a longer history. And they haven't been as class-cucked by the Red Scare as much. That's the thing about Antifa, if we're thinking in pragmatic terms. The mainstream media will probably be negative about any direct action group no matter what. So the important thing is to have one's own independent networks and actually have the right kind of social atmosphere to have any apparent legitimacy. That's something that's lacking around the American Antifa. And as a result, some of its political action becomes very individualized in a negative way. Some people are asking about the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy. What could analytic philosophers learn from continental philosophy? I have to speak in very general terms here because those are such general labels, more general than I'd like them to be. I think it would be that philosophy can be a creative process, not necessarily reducible to something like clarification, and that it can also be awe-inspiring. It doesn't have to be dry, that the content and the style of philosophical writing can't always, and maybe shouldn't, be that neatly separated. Could the analytic continental divide ever be reconciled? Absolutely, and it should be. It's entirely possible for philosophers to draw from both analytic and continental philosophy, and some philosophers do. This divide is very recent anyway, and I think it's maintained partially because of the way philosophers in academic institutions divide themselves. It creates a kind of feedback loop when their students end up reproducing the divisions of the academic institution. This is partially related to this question, which I'm sorry I couldn't possibly answer. I have not looked much into philosophy of mind, but I love this question because it recognizes that science, and especially a new science like neuroscience, absolutely needs philosophy. When there were airheads on my Sam Harris video saying that philosophy is irrelevant. Really, philosophy and science is very rarely separate, and a lot of scientific theories are made on the background of philosophical assumptions. What makes the apparent divide so visible is the way that science and philosophy is divided institutionally. Anyway, I think that crossing the analytic continental divide is important for AI. There's a lot of things very important for AI theory that used to be the concern mostly only of continental philosophy, like embodied practice and phenomenology, which now analytic philosophers are taking up too.
You've made a video about Jordan Peterson's not understanding postmodernism, but what do you think of him, and his recent spike in popularity? Do you think he helps to educate people, or is he spreading misinformation?
Whether he helps people or not is not for me to judge, at least not in a psychological sense. I haven't looked into his clinical practice because that's not something that particularly interests me, but I imagine that it being his actual field of education, he's better informed in psychiatry than in philosophy. The problem is that when he takes up philosophy and cultural criticism and the like, he is spreading misinformation. Not just in the obvious case of postmodernism, but other philosophers too. I remember in one lecture he misattributed an Albert Camus quote to Nietzsche, which is really strange as they're such famous philosophers. Another thing about him is that he seems kind of unstable, for lack of a better word. What I mean is he has wanted to create a computer program that would detect usage of so-called postmodern terminology in university professors and dox them to encourage them being fired. Note, not based on the actual contents of what they teach, but the words they use. Now, considering Peterson is known for being some kind of free speech warrior, that's a pretty Orwellian tactic, and I hate using that word, but it's fitting in this case. Of course, he ended up not doing this because his colleagues talked him out of it, but the fact that he even publicly considered it is worrisome. Also, the fact that he would recommend absolute garbage philosophical literature, like that book by Stephen Hicks, kind of makes me wonder what's going on in his head at all.
Many of your videos expose the flawed arguments of scientists who proclaim on deep questions of philosophy, while showing contemptuous ignorance for the discipline. Do we overvalue science, and the modernist and materialist values that go with it, or are we just demanding more simplistic answers to complex problems?
I don't think we overvalue science, as it is very valuable, but we overestimate its explanatory power in certain fields. In the past few hundred years, science has made incredible progress and has seriously made a lot of things easier and more efficient, and this kind of naturally led a lot of people to adopt an attitude of, well, if science did this much, it can do anything. But this is not necessarily the case. Science, at least as it exists today, has inherent limitations when it comes to things like art, ethics, phenomenology, or even culture. Now, for example, there's a viral video in which Richard Dawkins explains the legitimacy of science in terms of its usefulness. That it works, it makes computers work, it makes planes fly. Now, this kind of pragmatic justification I have a lot of sympathy for, but Richard Dawkins also praised Lawrence Krauss's book A Universe from Nothing, in which a lot of the claims are untested or even untestable speculations that, even if somehow confirmed, wouldn't have direct pragmatic results. For example, the membranes in M theory are so small that to get the kind of empirical confirmation of them that we have of quarks, we'd need a particle accelerator literally larger than the universe. So that kind of leaves the field of pragmatism. Science is also never truly divorced from philosophy, although some people think it is. It is only divorced in that way because of the way that academic institutions are divided. And it's not just that such books by, for example, Krauss are trustworthy because they use the scientific method, which has been shown to work. If you look into philosophy of science, you see how there isn't actually a single scientific method down to which all science could be reduced to. It's actually incredibly difficult to identify some necessary and sufficient conditions for what could legitimately be called science, because science always proceeds in the context of numerous bundles of theories and research programs. Another problem is that today there's this tendency, not so much among actual scientists, but pop scientists and their fans, to worship science like it's this single, monolithic, and eternal figure, like the I fucking love science Facebook page. I'm not here doing the dumb criticism of, oh, you don't have faith in God, but you have faith in science. That's not what I'm doing. I think this kind of currently popular view does a disservice to scientific fields, or is at least a misrepresentation of them. Science is not a single monolithic entity. It's a multiplicity of different processes, different methods, and different areas of research. And just like any other human activity, it manifests itself in institutions and people.
I think Marxist alienation plays a role in the modern day. Specifically in dating, and specifically in places such as Japan where there's dating apps people marry.
I think it's completely ubiquitous. It's just as common in the US as it is in Japan, but Japan is special in that they have used technology to complement alienation in a very different way than the US. I think this would merit an entire video on phenomena like virtual dating partners and cafes where you pay people to cuddle you. It's strange to me that a lot of pro-capitalists blame the left for the disintegration of the traditional family, when it has been the mechanisms of capital that with extreme force and mercilessly has just ripped the so-called nuclear family to shreds, for better or worse.
Could you do a video on Bourdieu?
Yes, I think I will in the future. There are a lot of people asking me how to get into philosophy. There's a general problem with this question because philosophy is admittedly such an extremely diverse field. First of all, you have to decide what you're interested in within philosophy. Is it ethics? Is it theory of knowledge, political philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of history, history of philosophy? Are you interested in any particular philosophical movements or categories? You simply have to pick something to start with. Some people say that if you want to get into philosophy, you start with the Greeks, like Plato. That could be helpful if you want to learn about the history of Western philosophy in a linear way, but it's not necessarily helpful. It won't directly help you jump right into contemporary debates in philosophy. If you do want to take the linear Western historical approach, there's a good series of lectures by Arthur Holmes on YouTube that I'll link in the description. If you've decided what particular areas you're interested in, as I've recommended before, browse some articles in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There's also a series of books called Very Short Introductions from Oxford that have a lot of editions on philosophy, and they're very basic and accessible. They aren't consistently good, so don't read them uncritically. I mean, you don't read anything uncritically, right? But they have short and accessible introductions to specific philosophers and specific philosophical topics and specific philosophical movements. There's also the podcast, The Partially Examined Life, which I love, and they have episodes on a whole bunch of different philosophers. Now, some of the episodes might be difficult for you if you're a complete beginner, as they are experienced in philosophy and often use philosophical terminology and name drop people, but their episodes can work well as a kind of preliminary introduction before you read a certain philosophical work. So as a general guide, I recommend you to pick a starting point you're interested in and then let it branch out into others. Pick an influential work. If it's too difficult, find an introductory article or a study guide or a lecture or a YouTube video. If you come across a term or person you're not familiar with, look up introductory material on that. I believe that there's no single privileged starting point or foundation in philosophy from which to start from. So pick your own starting point and then gradually fill in the gaps.
You've done a lot of videos on right-wing criticisms of postmodern ideology. What's your takes on left-wing critiques from the likes of Noam Chomsky or Frederick Jameson?
It's very strange to see Noam Chomsky and Frederick Jameson in the same sentence when talking about theory. Noam Chomsky isn't very good when it comes to theory, in my experience. I've loved his stuff on American foreign policy, and he has introduced a lot of people to anarchism, but his flaws in theory are very apparent. For example, in the debate with Foucault, or when he talked about morality, or of course, postmodernism. And when he was asked about Marxism, he said that he doesn't even understand what dialectics are. Is his critique better than Jordan Peterson's or not? Well, it's better in the sense that while Jordan Peterson tries to explain Foucault and Derrida and miserably fails, At least Chomsky just says that he doesn't understand them. At least his critique doesn't have that cartoon villain element that Peterson's has, where postmodern theorists just hate Western civilization for no reason other than hate and are just, evil cartoon villains. As a critique, it honestly doesn't amount to much because, again, he mostly just claims that he doesn't understand them and that because of that, there's no substance to them. Fredric Jameson, on the other hand, is a great theorist and very worth reading, not just because he has interesting insights in his own right, but because he actually bothered to read up on what he criticizes. It's funny to me that the most worthwhile and well-read critiques of postmodernism have come from Marxists or ex-Marxists like Habermas, who was part of the Frankfurt School, but Jordan Peterson fans can't draw from their critiques because to them, postmodernists and Marxists are essentially just different strands of cultural Marxism or whatever.
What are your views on aesthetics and philosophy of art? Alternately, which philosophies of art do you find most intriguing?
I haven't looked into aesthetics much. From the aesthetics class I took last year, the most intriguing philosophers I read was Alvar Noé. I have no idea how to pronounce that name. For example, his work Strange Tools, as well as Gadamer and his notions of play, the symbol, and the festival.
Can an ANCAP also be a postmodernist?
Of course. I mean, Nick Land, whose main inspiration is Deleuze, among others, is some kind of ultra-capitalist cyber-fascist. Although it does depend on the foundations of your political beliefs. A lot of ANCAPs justify capitalism with reference to unconditioned, eternal, and universal property rights, which is an approach that's at odds with a lot of postmodern theory.
How do you create your videos? Do you first write a script of sorts, record the audio and then match the ideas, themes with images? Or do you just go with the flow and not read off of something previously written?
The former. It's a very linear process. I come up with an idea, I write down the script, I record the audio, and then I match the visuals. I always thought that it would be easier for me to work without a script, but whenever I start recording in front of a microphone, I just start stumbling over my own words.
Have you formally studied philosophy?
Yes, I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and I'm starting my master's degree this year. Some people are asking about my beliefs on race and IQ. I think it's an example of a very modern and very misguided attempt to quantify literally everything. What were your red pill moments? My red pill moment was when I was 13 and uncritically thought that there was something to race realism. I think the whole obsession with IQ is itself mistaken when it's taken as a single quantitative indication of a person's intelligence, when the people who take it as such can't even sufficiently define what they mean by intelligence, because it really isn't obvious. I mean, a person can be an amazing engineer and yet terrible at formal logic. And a person who's a genius in formal logic could sound like a blockhead when attempting cultural criticism. The other problem is the assumption that IQ is primarily determined genetically, which is clearly not the full story. A lot of the so-called studies in race science completely ignore environmental and social factors. For example, there was a study on sugarcane farmers in India who are less poor one half of the year because they only gain their income after harvest. They were given IQ tests and they consistently scored higher the half of the year after harvest when they were less poor than the half before harvest. So in just half a year, a decrease in poverty can increase your performance on an IQ test. Now, consider the increase in IQ that growing up in a place with access to healthcare, education, and other productive activities has on a person. Now, this is not to say that biological factors have absolutely no effect on IQ, but to use it to group different members in society for some political purpose is unwarranted and absurd and also just unhelpful. I think it would end up punishing people who are already disenfranchised in the first place. Finally, even if we did have a single coherent notion of what intelligence is, and even if IQ did sufficiently measure it, this still wouldn't provide us with a guide for how to hierarchically rank society into groups, as some race realists think it does. Simply because intelligence is not the only thing that's valuable in society. There's practical skill, physical strength, strength of character, artistic genius, etc., etc.
How do you view the relationship between analytic moral philosophy and continental moral philosophy, or analytic ethics and continental ethics?
Again, I have to speak in very general terms here. The way I see it, analytic philosophy has often tried to take a somewhat disinterested approach to ethics, kind of a bird's eye view, while a lot of continental ethics have argued that ethical matters are never a matter of disinterested observation. So in my experience, again, speaking very generally, analytic philosophy has been used more in decision-making in larger institutions, such as legislation or so-called business ethics, while continental philosophy is a lot more helpful when it comes to immediate life choices and dispositions, as well as more overarching ethical critiques of social and political arrangements and dominant values. Also, you're wrong on that. It's actually The Accursed Chair, Volume 2 by Bataille.
Are you a moral objectivist, subjectivist, intersubjectivist, or other? What do you think of moral relativism versus moral realism?
I'm not a moral realist, although that's not the same as being a moral relativist, as another person has pointed out, merely a moral anti-realist. There's a common misstep people make when talking about philosophy and using the word relativism, kind of similarly to individualism, because the term on its own isn't very meaningful if you don't qualify in what sense you're using it. And people also assume that there's this simple dichotomous distinction between relativism and objectivism. For example, in ethics, you have descriptive relativism, the claim that different people have different ethical values, meta-ethical relativism, the claim that we can't objectively determine which values are quote-unquote correct, and normative relativism, the claim that we should tolerate all values equally. I am a moral relativist descriptively and meta-ethically, but not normatively.
Do you think that being able to read fast has any use in philosophy?
Not at all. In fact, when it comes to many philosophical works, you'll have to end up slowing down on purpose.
How does the term Marxist end up being associated with SJW or radical feminism, and this mainly on the American political sphere?
On the one hand, it's the simple tendency for people to just label all of their political opponents under a single overarching category. So some right-wingers take intersectional feminism, Marxism-Leninism, left anarchism, post-structuralism, and even social democracy and put them all under the Marxist label, or cultural Marxist, or postmodern neo-Marxist, or whatever. Even if all of those ideologies are very different in foundations, in history, theory, practice, and outcomes. On the other hand, it's also partially because some Marxists are feminists. There's a whole branch of Marxist feminism. And conversely, for instance, some intersectional feminists may draw on Marxist analysis when talking about intersections with regards to class. So they do interact.
Do you believe Nietzsche played a role in fascism? Also, Derrida said something like, we can't say Nietzsche was the base of Nazism, but we can't say he didn't play a role in it either. So what do you think about that?
Of course Derrida would say that. But I agree with him. On the one hand, Nietzsche would have clearly disliked Nazi Germany on many fronts. He absolutely despised anti-Semites. There was an anti-Semitic writer by the name of Fritsch who would send Nietzsche his writings, and Nietzsche responded to him saying, "I beg you to stop sending me your publications if you please. I fear for my patience." He also hated German nationalism, so that's a pretty big one. On the other hand, there's no denying that he believed in ranking society in a strict hierarchical manner, and even said that some type of slavery is inevitable. He also very explicitly disliked the democratic, anarchist, and communist movements of his time. Now, one notable thing here, in my opinion, is that Nietzsche wouldn't have wanted his philosophy to be just a scholarly exercise of what would Nietzsche say about this, but more like a tool, or even, as he put it, a hammer, to smash things with. So the fact that his philosophy has had so many incompatible uses is actually kind of true to his philosophy in a way. Hitler was supposedly influenced by Nietzsche, but for example, Trotsky read Nietzsche too. And a lot of the most insightful late 20th century leftists drew from Nietzsche, especially when it comes to his critique of moralizing or sinful guilt. Is it more the left or the right that's currently characterized by slave morality? I'd say both. It's important also to note that Nietzsche, although not a leftist, was also definitely not a conservative in the literal and broad sense of wanting to conserve certain political arrangements. He wanted to destroy them to make space for new ones so that new values could be built. That's why he would have wanted nothing to do with Jordan Peterson and his defense of quote-unquote Western values. Peterson, in Nietzsche's eyes, would be like the biggest preacher of life denial, someone who wants to subordinate life to currently existing values, and Christian values at that. So that's enough for now. Thank you guys for watching, and thank you for your support. I really appreciate it. I'm not sure if I should name my patrons for a Q&A video, but I guess I will just in case. So thanks to Einziggy Stardust, Lucy Pearson, Dson, Aescetics, Nikolaj Lisek, Eric Coronado, Tommerino, Mary of Magdala, comfyakerman, Dan Chaplin, Three-Way Seats, Ilja Pippa, JSON Bourne, Aperture 413, CriminallyVulgar, Cadell Last, Azzy the Mazzy, Homeless Snail, Doland E Strong Jr., Noah Trapolino, CancerPigeons, Simon Cook, Yàvin Arba, Arc Stanton, Space Smile, Pistol Pete, Stephen Z, Aiden Williams, Elizabeth Ward, Joseph Patrone, Badhorn Choir, Quantum Computation, Rooftop Korean, IndustrialRobot, Kelly Rankin, John Drum, No, Yvonne, Jinsoo An, Gibbering Idiot, Carrie, Juan Chavez, Timour Maar, Numu, Andrew Burns, Michael Doherty, D. Lang, Sina B, Isobel Abdolali, Robert Phillips, Adam Johns, Tendies123, John Beatles, and Suzie Oh. That's a lot. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to do this, but thank you.